So this is a really complex topic that I want to dive into just about as soon as I can. I'm going to go over it briefly what exactly I want to talk about and go through, but there's a lot to go through because there's so many questions about it and so many different ideas that we don't necessarily understand about it that I want to get through it and discuss as much as I possibly can. So this is going to be about God and the biblical series. And I've listened a lot to different lectures, to different ideas about this, and especially with the religion teacher that I was talking about that is one of my friends now, Kevin, he especially gives me a lot of insight into this particular topic. And so I'm going to go through what I believe to be the case and what makes the most sense to me. And I'm also going to go through what other people may believe and why they may believe it, psychologically speaking, of course. And the third thing I'm going to go through is some of the I can't say minor stories, some of the stories in the biblical series that I've heard lectures about, to try and discuss just what they mean exactly, because they're very important. They're very important for fundamental. They're very fundamental ideas and concepts that are super important in life. And so let's begin first with the history, I suppose. So, well, where did the Bible come from? Well, it originally, it's had different iterations over the course of over 2,000 years. Of course, we're in 2023, and the fundamental way that we calculate our time is based off of when the Creator in human form, typically referred to in Christianity as Jesus, was born, which was, of course, 2,023 years ago. So that's how we see it. Now, recently, of course, as you may know, how we now see it is, before what we were saying is, so we would be 2023 AC, so after Christ, then you could have like 10,000 BC, before Christ. Now they've reverted it into a more overall encompassing way of saying it, which is now it's now 2023 CE, which is Common Era, and you could say 10,000, 8,000 any time before that, 10,000 BCE, before Common Era. But they're talking about the exact same thing. And so what is this Christ figure that they're talking about? Well, the best way that I've heard Jesus Christ, as the many different iterations that it has in many different religions with different names, but they all stem back from the same type of person. So what is this Jesus Christ character? Is essentially the most optimal human being that you could possibly imagine. The most good in a person you could possibly become. It's the ideal of a human. Now, of course, it's impossible to get to that ideal, and there's many ways to look at the Bible, especially in terms of what he did, that you can't necessarily understand just how he could be human, because, of course, yet again, I'm gonna go based off of the Christian's idea of the Bible and of Jesus Christ and of God, and I'm going to compare that to some other religions. I'm not very familiar with other religions, but I have a good idea. So I'm going to try my best to interpret all the information that I do have and try to explain it forthrightly. So this Christ figure is supposed to be, from what I understand, the best possible image of a human. And so it's our ideal. It's something we're supposed to aspire to look forward to try and become. And of course we'll never be able to become that because it's so incredibly perfect, and especially, of course, in the Bible, as you may know, there are many different miracles that this Jesus Christ figure does. One of them, for example, he cures a person with leper. That's one of them. Another one is he cures blind people. I don't have very specific examples because I haven't gone very deep into it, but I have a basic understanding at the very least, so it's at least something to work off of. And so, what I want to generalize that to is that clearly, for the most part, if most religions stem off of the fact that there was this figure in history 2023 years ago, or whatever time period they may have set instead, but we'll go for 2023 years ago, just to simplify. If most religions have that, then that essentially means the point of the religion is to make yourself into the best possible person, which of course is something that I'm a big advocate of. Is you should try and always improve yourself as much as possible to become the best possible version of yourself. And of course that's a lot easier said than done, which is why this Christ figure is he's illuminated in such a high sense, because it's not really something you can conceptualize. Of course, doing miracles, human life itself is already a miracle in and of itself. It's the fact that the chance of us being here is so incredibly unlikely. The fact that it's even happened is a miracle on its own. And then the fact that we have a consciousness is beyond belief how that works. And so this Christ figure is the ideal that you need to improve yourself as much as possible to try and get as close to that ideal as possible. And that's what most religions, I believe, try and advocate. At least that's definitely what the Christianity, I suppose I should say, tries to advocate, is to try and become the best force of good in the world. We'll go with that. That's a good definition. And so moving beyond that is the fact that not only is this Jesus Christ character an ideal for the best potential human, but on top of that is that it is a God in human form, which is really something to think about, because why the hell would, if, and I want to say this seriously before I go on. Truthfully, I do absolutely believe there has to be a creator of some sort. I have no idea beyond that belief, because I'm a very scientific person. I need evidence, but my strongest point of evidence that I've heard is what happens without a God, what happens without a creator, because we can't create these things that existed around us. So what happens without it is that the entire fundamental aspect of reality collapses, because, and of course I don't know too many theories about how the universe began, but of course the most popular one, most likely, that you've heard of is the Big Bang Theory. Well, even if the Big Bang Theory is true, where does it all begin before that? Right? And so you have this idea that there was this giant explosion in the universe that started everything. All right, where'd the explosion come from? And so you can't answer that, because you can't have something from nothing. That's not how it works. You can't just, it's fundamentally impossible, and especially in the scientific point of view, is that if you have nothing to work with, something can't ever come out of it. And so that's the exact same thing with this universe idea with the Big Bang Theory. It couldn't have existed without something else before it that we can't understand, and that could be something in the fourth dimension that we can't possibly see. So I'm going to go into this a little bit, is that this is how I like to see it, in terms of different dimensions, is that imagine, so a 1D dimension is of course just one dimensional. It's like a stick. It's like one entire line of pixels going straight in one direction, any one direction, but it's only one direction because it's one dimensional. And so one dimensional can't envision two-dimensional objects. Of course that makes sense, because one dimensional can only see the first dimension. And so whenever you move beyond that, there's two-dimensional, where you have an X and you have a Y. I should have put it the other way around. You have an X and you have a Y. And so what that seems to me is that since we're in the third dimension, of course, if something's in 2D, it can't perceive us. And of course, we don't know what it's like to be in 2D because we live in a third dimensional environment. And so, but what that could mean is that we live in a three-dimensional environment, of course, X, Y, and Z. Now, you could say we live in a fourth dimension if you were to consider time as a dimension, and I definitely believe it could be considered as a dimension. But for the sake of simplicity, because I don't know too much about that topic specifically about the different dimensions, we're going to just say we live in a three-dimensional environment because it's the best idea that I have currently. And so you have the x, y, z. Now, what goes beyond? Once you have the fourth dimension, what does that even look like? Well, you may have seen, and perhaps you haven't. You can search up online a picture, and it's the best representation we have of what the fourth dimension looks like. It's a four-dimensional hypercube, if I'm not mistaken. That's what it's called. And so it's two three-dimensional cubes combined into each other, and it's almost impossible for me to explain that. But just imagine if, what could I say? If I'll go with circles just to make it for simplicity. So these are two circles, and so we'll pretend as if they're cubes, just because I used the cube idea before, and they'd be overlapping like this, and that's very hard to see. They'd be overlapping like this, where they're each inside each other about 50%. And so that's exactly what the fourth dimension is. And so it would be adding an extra layer of depth that we can't even interpret because we don't live in that dimension. And so, well, what if the creator is in that dimension? Whatever you may want to call it, God, creator. And if there's multiple, if you believe in that, because Norse mythology especially, that's such an interesting one that I haven't been able to get into yet. And partially it's because I want to have a very credible source and a very good lecturer that is able to properly articulate exactly what Norse mythology has. But of course, multiple different creators in that type of mythology, in that type of religion, if you will. And so, and so, that's potentially what a creator could live in, is this fourth dimension that we can't possibly perceive. We can perceive the first dimension, obviously, the second dimension, obviously, with computers, such as this one, and third dimensionally, because we live in it, and we can't envision fourth dimension. So that's something we don't know. And one of the things that I love this so much. So I'm going to go first into how would I say that? The different beliefs that people have. Let's go with that. And so, of course, there's atheists who believe that there is no God or no creator or anything of the sort whatsoever. And the best argument against atheists that I've seen that is so incredibly true. There was a university professor, I believe it was, and one of the students was absolutely a hardcore atheist, and they were very smart as well, very intelligent, and high in openness, of course. So, and very high in trait intelligence. And so the professor asked this student, "All right, you seem like a very smart kid, of course." And the professor said, "Well, I'm going to draw this circle." So he drew a circle. And he said, "This circle is an embodiment of the entire knowledge of the entire universe. Absolutely everything that could possibly exist, whether we know it or not, it all fits within this circle. So you're a pretty smart kid. Draw a line and section out the part that you believe you understand. So how much of the entire everything that you could possibly know, section off a line of what you believe you understand or not you have knowledge about already." And so I think the student did like 10%, which is already, so 10% of the entire circle. He said that he understood, which is already, that is an insane amount, which I would put it at less than 1% at the very least. There's absolutely no way we know 10%. Like, nobody knows. There's so much that's so unknown. But anyways, he put 10% of the circle, and then the university professor, of course, was like, "Well, you say you don't believe at all that there could ever possibly be a creator, but there's also 90% of the entirety of all knowledge that we know, whether we know it or not. There's all of this 90% that you don't know. And so couldn't a creator exist inside of this dimension that you don't know? And so, well, if you don't know whether or not there's a creator, you're an agnostic." So already that completely disproves any atheist, which just blew my mind. Because I knew there was always something wrong about atheists. It's just, there had to have been some sort of scientifically proven way to show that atheism just can't possibly be true. that basically breaks it down completely, is that at the very least, you can't believe that there's no such thing as a creator whatsoever because you don't know. There's no 100% definitive answer that there's no creator. And so, at the very least, everyone in the world is agnostic. They must be because they don't know that answer. Now, of course, it could still be wrong. I'm not saying that a creator is definitely without the case absolutely must be true. However, that's what I believe, is that it should be true. There must be a creator. But it could still be false. But at the very least, everyone should be agnostic in the fact that they don't know if there's a creator or not. And so then, of course, you have people who are believers. And so that's where you go into theist ideas. And there's monotheism, monotheistic and polytheistic ideas. Polytheistic being there's more than one creator, which I believe Buddhism, it's either Buddhism or Hinduism or perhaps both. Those are two very, very hyper popular religions who have more than one God that they believe in. And of course, Christianity is a monotheistic idea. And for the sake of simplicity, because I don't really care beyond the point that if there's more than one creator, I don't really care beyond that point. So for the sake of simplicity, I'll just say I'm a monotheist, that I believe there has to be at least one creator. And of course, like I said at the very beginning, the reason why I believe there has to be at least one creator is because what happens if there is no creator? Because you can't get something from nothing. Of course, with the Big Bang Theory, there's nothing that exists beforehand, then a giant explosion happens, and then something exists, and that can't possibly be true. It could be something that we can't see within our dimensional environment. Of course, our three-dimensional environment. It could be something beyond our environment. But still, there has to be something that exists, whether we know it or not. It doesn't matter if we know it or not. There has to be something. That's how I see it anyways. And so, now I believe I'm going to go a little bit more into the stories of the Bible and why exactly they've been translated so many times over 2,000 years. Because that's a really significant thing, is the fact that the Bible is over 2,000 years long, and it has been preserved and kept in very good condition, if you will, over the course of over two millennia. And so that has to have some sort of significant factor that we need to understand, because it means that there's something in there that is fundamental to human life that we need to understand, and that we need to try and envision how it could impact our future. And so I'm going to start off first of all, and I'm going to explain first the different ideas that the Bible has and the different perspectives that you should be taking with the Bible. Now, this is the best way that I've heard it put, is that you need to see the Bible as there's different types of truth. There's literal truth, there's historical truth, there's also religious truth, there's also faithful truth, if I'm not mistaken. There is that I think that's all the truths that I know of, but the main point to understand is that there are different types of truths, and you can't take everything that you see in the Bible literally. Now, did Jesus Christ literally, actually create miracles? You may not be able to perceive that as literally true. It could be historically truth, to where there was some sort of, or symbolic truth, I should say, that's another truth. It could be some sort of symbolic truth. It could be some sort of religious truth, where it's more so a faith in the person themselves as being a good person, rather than literally doing miracles. And so now I'm going to dive into actually more specifically one of the stories, which is Adam and Eve, and that is from the Old Testament. It's from Genesis. It's one of the oldest stories that we have from this biblical series. And so what does Adam and Eve represent? Well, Adam and Eve, if you don't know, represents the beginning of humankind. They were the first two that supposedly God created and put on earth. And now, obviously, we know scientifically that we evolved over generations from chimps and apes and I believe gorillas, although I'm not quite sure about that one. But we evolved after hundreds of thousands, millions of years. And So the fact that there were just two humans that were put by God on earth is just, you can't look at it that way. That's not, it's not literal truth. Now there's probably, and there's almost certainly symbolic truth in that. Is that, what does Adam and Eve represent? They represent the beginning of human consciousness. So Adam and Eve were put into the Garden of Eden. That's where they originally came from. And so God put them here, and what the Garden of Eden essentially was a sanctuary. It was essentially heaven on earth. That's the best way of putting it. It was perfection everywhere. And so I believe it was actually first Adam that was put on earth, and it was I believe it was 7 days that it took God to create earth, and on the seventh day was whenever Adam was created, if I'm not mistaken. And Adam was given Eve as a gift, if you will, by God in order to start the progression of human life. And so that's essentially the beginning of human consciousness. And more specifically, there's a specific example of where this comes up. Is I believe they were Adam and Eve were, of course, since there were no clothes, they were naked the entire time. But it was so interesting because, of course, in the beginning there was nothing that existed, and so they didn't have any perception of what consciousness could even be. So they never even realized that they were naked because they didn't know what that meant. And by the way, just a little side here, nakedness actually represents a sense of vulnerability, because of course people traditionally who are naked in public would be embarrassed by this, and that's because nakedness is seen as a sense of vulnerability and exposing yourself to the world, obviously. And so whenever Adam and Eve eventually realized that they were naked, that was the flip in which consciousness first emerged in the biblical series, in human existence even. And now, of course, you can't really interpret Adam and Eve as real characters, because that can't be literally true, because we have scientific evidence to prove that we evolved from other animals. However, you can see it symbolically in the fact that this is where consciousness could have came to be. There's something hidden there. There's something further that wasn't. That's one of the things I had a little bit of issues with lectures I was listening to. And of course, it is a very complex topic, so it's hard to even figure out what you want to talk about and extract from all the information that's inside the biblical series. But even if Adam and Eve is the representation of human consciousness, or at least partially the representation of human consciousness, there has to be something deeper there. And I don't have nearly enough research on the topic at all to figure out just how much deeper that goes, because there's so many incredible mysteries that you can uncover, and you can look at the Bible and really dissect it, really, because I believe there's over, like, if I'm not mistaken, 10,000 different, how would you say, different references to different parts of the Bible all over. There's over 10,000 different links and references across the entire Bible. And so it's a very interconnected story. And so it was clearly very well thought out. It wasn't just a spur of the moment thing that they just put together, that whoever put it together. And I'm not entirely sure. I believe there was a multitude of different people who put it together. However, I'm not exactly sure who their names were, and I can't even say if that's true or not, right? Different types of truth. However, what I can say is that clearly, however this was put together, it was thought out very methodically in order to make the most possible confusion, essentially, that there could be. There's so much mystery in it that just, you can't get answers. No matter how many times you get answers out of it, there's always more answers to extract from it, essentially. And so the Adam and Eve, and being the representation of consciousness, whenever they realized that they were naked, there's got to be something deeper that goes beyond that. And I'm trying to think right now exactly what that could be. And potentially, it could potentially be such that when humans, when you as a person realize your vulnerability, that's when you gain power. When you realize that you can be deceived, because that, as I've talked about before, is that there's a certain type of trust that you want to have in people. You can't trust people with by being just completely naive, but you also can't be cynical and trust no one. Because if you're naive and you trust someone, that's not a virtue. Because you're not realizing that people are malevolent and can still cause you pain even if you trust them. And of course, if you don't trust anybody, then you're cynical, and that's also not a virtue. You may think it is because then, well, you're mature, you've thought about it. Well, no, because then how can you ever have human relationships without trust? And so it has to be some sort of courageous trust. And I believe in part that that links to the Bible, and it's really important link because, of course, that's an important factor to include in your life is to have courageous trust. Is that if you realize just how much you don't know about yourself, you will go a very long way. You need to understand your weaknesses. You need to understand your vulnerabilities. And so that's part of consciousness is understanding what you don't know about yourself and becoming more aware of yourself. And so that's, of course, part what I'm trying to do here is trying to understand my way of thinking and trying to articulate it to the best possible sense that I can. And it's obviously not easy because there's so many different ideas that I have going on in my head trying to figure all of this out. And so, of course, since Adam and Eve is this idea of consciousness, then that could easily be the link between the Adam and Eve stories and life as such an important human idea that needs to be understood is that you have weaknesses and you need to understand you have weaknesses and you need to be conscious about them and you need to work towards understanding yourself as much as possible. That's what consciousness is. Now there's another side thing here that, and I can't remember fully what it was, but I believe there was a tree in the Eden garden that God said, just never ever take a fruit from this tree. That's all that God told Adam and Eve. Never take a fruit from this tree. And everywhere else they could go and it would be fine. Just never take a fruit from this tree. And if you do that, what's so interesting, this is a psychological fact, and this is especially true with children. If you tell a child not to do something and don't explain why, they're much more likely to try it and do it, just to see what happens. That's curiosity, obviously. And so, God telling Adam and Eve not to take this fruit from the tree, of course, triggers that instinct of, well, what happens if I do? It's a mystery, and we're very curious creatures, of course. We want to know answers. For the most part, I believe extremely low in openness people do not want to have answers at all, and they just want to stay stagnant and as routine and as straight to the guidelines as possible, if you will. And so, this idea of the tree where if you, how would I say that? If you tell someone not to do something, they're more likely to do it. That's such an important life value as well, is to understand that. Is that you need to know that sometimes you shouldn't get an answer no matter how badly you want to know it. And sometimes you won't get an answer no matter how badly you want to know it. There are times, especially I've seen it so many times in relationships, where I've seen people that they want to get answers. They want to know why the hell something happened. And sometimes you're going to try so hard to understand, to know what happened. If it's a breakup, why did this breakup occur? Now, of course, you can learn from mistakes that perhaps occurred during this breakup and to learn from them. But if there's certain aspects that you don't understand why they happened, you may never get that answer. And it's probably better if you don't get that answer. That's more important. Because what happened whenever it was Eve that went to get a fruit from the tree, that was the first true consciousness choice, if you will, by Adam and Eve, and specifically Eve, obviously, is that she decided to go and take that fruit from the tree. It was completely conscious, and it was going against the act of God. And so that's just the first through human action against God's will. And so that's where deviation started to occur. And so I'll go further into them after. But it's just so interesting, the fact that all of that's linked so deeply with our understanding of human consciousness and of our idea of morality, and also about our perception of the world and how we attempt to, how would I say that? Our perception of the world and how we, at least in part, try to figure out things that we don't know. That's what I wanted to say. And so now, that's about as much as I could understand fully of Adam and Eve to a certain degree that I'm comfortable talking about. So now I'm going to move on to the story of Cain and Abel. Now, Cain and Abel were essentially, and of course this is, yet again, it can't be literal truth, it absolutely can't be, but they were the children of Adam and Eve. That's what they represent, at least. And so this is how it worked. Abel was essentially complete order and just about the best kind of person you could imagine in any society. And Cain was complete chaos and the destruction and the most hated person, essentially, that you could see in a possible environment in a society. And so they represent order and chaos, and I believe I've talked partially, at least, about order and chaos and what they represent. And so chaos, if we don't have order and chaos in our life, you need to have both, otherwise either way is going to be a terrible trajectory downward. Because if you have too much chaos, then of course you can't make progress forward, because everything's always going wrong all the time. And that's that catastrophe snowball effect that I talked about. I believe it was in my second video. And if you have order all the time, then everything's going perfectly, and then there's no deviation, and eventually humankind would want to make some sort of deviation. So someone at some point, if it becomes so orderly, they would purposely do something just to throw everything out of the loop, because it would be too perfect. And so right now we're heading towards trying to get as orderly as possible, which is absolutely not what we want. And I'm a very orderly person as well. I'm high in conscientiousness, so I score very high in industriousness and very high in orderliness. And so, but I can clearly see, yes, I love orderliness, but without the chaos, making things orderly is not fun. Essentially, that's what it is. Because I like sorting things, I like organizing things, I like figuring things out, and if everything was already figured out, then there's nothing to figure out. I'm a very big problem solver. And so problems need chaos. And problems need to be solved, and that's where the order comes in. There needs to be that balance. And so that's what Cain and Abel represented. And so Abel was favored by God, clearly, very favored by God, very favored by everyone else as well. And by all the animals. I believe it was the animals, because of course there was no one else. It was only Cain, Abel, Adam, and Eve. And so Abel was favored by Adam and Eve, and favored by God, and favored by all the animals and all that. And Cain was resentful of this and very, very jealous. He was hyper jealous of this. And so that's a really important understanding, is that what you need to take away from that is that you are definitely going to be jealous of things in your life as well. I know I was also stricken by this. I believe stricken is the right word for that. I've never actually tried to use that in a sentence before. But I was stricken by that a few times in my life, and I know I will continue to be stricken by that. And you need to understand is when you're jealous of something, you're really jealous of something, because jealousy is actually a good thing if it's not all the time. If you're jealous of absolutely everything, there's absolutely no direction in whatsoever, and you're just a resentful and jealous person. You envy everybody. Now, if you're only jealous about very particular things at a very small amount of times, then you can perhaps realize that maybe that's what you want to aim for. And so I can't really think of an example of things that I was jealous about. But you could think of, like, if you are a person that perhaps is jealous of someone who has a very successful business, perhaps. Let's go with that. That's a good example. If you're jealous of someone who has a very successful business, and that's the only thing you're jealous of, you don't have any other type of jealousy anywhere else spread across multiple different domains, then maybe that's what you should try and aspire to. Perhaps you should instead transfer over that jealousy of the person who has this successful business and try to orient your life towards that goal and make them the ideal you want to reach. Now, it's really important, it's very crucial to know that you can't be jealous of everyone's successful life because your fate is without a doubt enough. There's enough going on in your life. You have no idea what's going on in their life. You see someone who's, like, for example, in a Lamborghini or something like that, and they have this beautiful woman with them, and you just gotta think, how much don't you know? And so maybe you could think about this from this perspective. Well, of course, his life must be perfect. But then there's the other side. That's the order perspective, is that everything must be perfect in his life because he's got so much going for him. Well, the chaos side that you can also look at, which of course people who are high in neuroticism and high in narcissism are going to look at this, and they're going to look at the chaos side, they're going to look at the bad side. And you can look at it like this and say, well, perhaps he got, in order to get into this position that he's in currently, he had to take a lot of serious risks, and at any point it could collapse because he's had to lie and cheat and steal his way to get to his position. And so at any point the entire system could collapse. And I'm a very strong believer that if you lie and if you cheat, if you steal, if you do any of these virtues that are purposely deceiving others, then it's guaranteed to come back and punish you in the long run. That's exactly what I believe. And so perhaps that's one of the things that this person is going through, is that you absolutely don't know, is that they have to lie and cheat and steal their way to get to their position. At any point it could collapse. On top of that, well, maybe the woman in his car could be a prostitute, or if not, but it could definitely be the case. But also on top of that, she could be a person that has a lot of catastrophes going on in her life. It's just a snowball effect of catastrophes. She's having an absolutely terrible life. She's filled with depression and anxiety and doesn't know what tomorrow holds for her. And you just think to yourself, once you look at it from that perspective, it's like, that's what you're jealous of? Something that you don't even know that could be the case? And so that's why I've heard this so strongly engraved into me, is that your fate is enough. You need to worry about your own life and not worry about others. And of course, like I said, you're definitely going to be jealous in life of other people, but you need to understand when that jealousy can be directed towards a goal that you might actually value. Because if you can have a goal that you actually value and realize you're headed towards that goal, of course you'll generate positive emotion, as I've talked about. And so that's so incredibly interesting, is that with these perspectives of chaos and order, you need to understand that there's so many different ways you can apply this to life. And so that's what Cain and Abel represented. And it's such an important value, another important value, just from the first two biblical series in Genesis, that can be applied to such a strong, important moral value in real life. And so there's got to be so much more in the Bible that you need to really delve into in order to understand. Because as I said, there's over 10,000 different references over the course of the entire Bible to all different links across each other. And so it's a very thought out, methodically planned book. It's really something absolutely marvelous. I've never actually read it personally. It's such a long book, and I don't know if I ever will, but I definitely try and understand it through other people as much as possible. And perhaps I should read it, I'm not sure. But at the moment, I do not have any intentions of reading. But there's so many different interpretations that you can take from the Bible and apply it to really important moral values and lessons in real life. And that's one thing that people just don't seem to understand. They don't know where to go with that. And they just think it's nothing. They think it's nonsense because they're only thinking of it from a literal point of view. They only think, okay, there's this Adam and Eve character. They were literally true? Okay, yeah, that's pushing it a little bit. Yeah, it definitely is pushing it a little bit. And maybe if you actually thought for half a second about what the hell that means to have the differences between truths, between symbolic truth, which is what Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel represent, compared to literal truth, you need to understand the differences between those and how you have to really apply them. You need to really think about these complex topics because it's a complex book. That's it's as simple as that. It's really a lot more complex than most people even put it out. Because whenever you think about reading a scientific research paper, it's really complex topics that you need to try and understand to the best of your ability. The Bible is on a completely different level of complexity compared to those because you need creative intelligence, you need intellectual intelligence, you need you need to have a really high open mind in order to understand these ideas and accept them, if you will, to try and figure out just what you're trying to get to the bottom to. It combines the most difficult elements of human characteristics all together to try and rule and figure some stuff out about it, and we still barely know nothing about it because there's so much more to interpret from it. And so that's probably why it's been passed down for over 2,000 years because there's so many important lessons in it that people just can't seem to understand that it has. And so that's what I'm trying to explain here. So back to Cain and Abel. So as I said, Cain was this character that was completely seen as pure chaos because he was the most unideal person that you could imagine. And Abel, on the other hand, was the most ideal person you can imagine, the perfect example of order, and Cain being the perfect example of chaos. And so what eventually happens is Cain gets so incredibly jealous and resentful and envious of Abel that he decides to murder Abel. And that's the first killer. First killer. Now, of course, we can't take that literally. That is a symbolic truth, however, because it shows that was the first deviation to the path of evil. Because without a doubt in life, there has to be good and evil. And to not think that is just something you haven't thought about it enough. Clearly, you haven't thought about it enough. Because if you think there have been very evil characters in the past, and there have been very good people in the past. Hitler, for example, is clearly an example of a very evil character, but people don't relate themselves to Hitler because they haven't killed, what was it, 20 million Jews, and I can't remember the other people, but it was primarily Jews, 20 million Jews, and so people don't often compare themselves at all to Hitler. But you need to understand one thing is that Hitler was a human, and you're a human too. And so exactly what Hitler was capable of, you're also capable of. And so that's humility, that's understanding what you don't know about yourself. And that's a really scary thing to try and understand, is that you're a lot more comparable to Hitler and to many other bad figures in human history than you may think. You may think that you're a good person and, oh yeah, I'd never do anything evil. Okay, maybe you wouldn't do anything that's to that extreme, but you're capable of it because you're human. And so that's something really important to think about that's just not talked about nearly enough anywhere at all. Especially in university. That's especially true. Apparently university does a really bad job of setting yourself up for life, which of course makes sense because, I mean, high school is just about the same. It barely sets you up at all, and so that's what I'm trying to figure out as much as I can. High school just tells you basically nothing, and so of course the university is going to follow that path, that trajectory of just not telling you anything. And so understanding these stories really, it sets you good moral values as a fundamental basis for life. You need to understand that you have a consciousness, that you are malevolent, and that you will cause pain to others. And you need to understand how to control your emotions. That's a huge one. There's so many more stories. One that I've tried to wrap my head around, and I can't really understand it to a full extent, is the Tower of Babel story. Apparently it's a very small story, and I'm going to have to listen to it again and really try and understand just what the hell it's trying to say. But the Tower of Babel, it's apparently a really small story, and it has such an important significance. And that just shows just how much this Bible was thought out, this book was thought out. Is that a a, 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 small story such as the Tower of Babel that has such an incredibly important psychological and humanistic importance to be so small and yet contain such power. It just shows you need to really pay attention to this and try and figure it out as much as you possibly can, because it could really save you early on in life and later on in life. That's why I'm trying to figure it out as much as I can. I try and wrap my head around these ideas as much as I possibly can, and it's not easy by any means. And it's 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 just a shame that these really important topics are just not discussed at all anywhere, unless if you do the research yourself. People low in openness are not going to do that research themselves because they probably just don't care. Or they would care, but they just don't care to try and do the research themselves. And so if it was presented to them in a proper way, perhaps that would change things a little bit. And so Cain eventually kills Abel, and this was the quote directly from the Bible, and hopefully I don't mess it up. This is what he said after he killed Cain, and he could not live with himself. And so this is what he said: "My punishment is too great to bear. My punishment is too great to bear." That's a huge one, is that he found himself being so incredibly corrupt after killing his brother that he didn't know what to do with his life. He had no direction. He couldn't believe, because he destroyed the ideal that he wanted. And so that's exactly what you do whenever you have a jealous, whenever you're jealous of someone, and you're just absolutely resentful, and you just want to bring them down. Well, then you bring down that ideal, and then you destroy the own goal that you didn't even realize that you could set for yourself in life, and then that ideal is dead to you, and then your punishment is too great to bear. You have this direction that you could have had, there was potential direction, and you crumpled it and threw it in the trash where you can never get it back. And people just don't understand that. That's the power of jealousy, is what you can take out of it. And so that's yet another important story, an important life idea that you need to try and take and implement into your life, because there's so much important significance that needs to be understood from it. And it could really save you a lot of time. It could really give you a good sense of direction in your life if you don't have one currently. And so Cain destroyed this ideal that he had, and he didn't know where to go after that, because that was a motivational force that if he manifested it properly, he could have went towards this goal of being fundamentally good, but instead he destroyed it because jealousy and envy corrupted him and completely destroyed everything that he was believing in, that he wanted to believe in, and it was gone. And so his punishment was too great to bear. And that's about as far as I can go into the Bible, or at least the most important parts that I wanted to discuss. And so I just want to recap what I said at the beginning, because I think this is so important, is that I do believe absolutely there has to be a creator, because the most important argument that I have is what happens if there isn't one. What happens to human existence, to human life, to universe, to the entire universe, to the complexity of universes? It all falls apart if there's nothing that was there to create it from the beginning, whether we can understand it or not, because it could be in that fourth dimension, or the fifth dimension, or the 50th dimension. It doesn't matter how far away it is. It's the fact that we don't understand it. But what happens if this thing that we don't understand doesn't exist, and it crumbles? Because we can't create a universe. We can't. We can create a simulated universe, which would be with programming and trying to create the best possible simulation in order to represent real life in a virtual environment. Even if, and this is of course a very famous theory, is that even if we are in a simulation, at some point there had to be a very first iteration. So of course we could either be the very first iteration, which is going to make a simulation, or we could be the last in that chain, because otherwise we can't be any of them in between. Because if we were any of the simulations in between, then Of course, we would already have a simulation that we would be watching over, but we don't have a simulation we would be watching over. So either we're the very first iteration of humankind, or of whatever we are, our essence or spirit, we're either the very first iteration, or we're the very last one, trying to create a new one. And even if we're the very last one, where did that first one come from? Because it couldn't have came from nothing. It has to be some sort of dimension that we don't understand. And so, what happens without God? Thank you.